Physics, Mao and the Manhattan Project. The story of Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was arguably one of the most important people in 20th century history, yet very few people have actually heard of him. So, who is this guy? Well, Klaus Fuchs was born in Germany in 1911 and died there in 1988, and I'll spare you the boring biographical details and instead attempt to tell you his story. Klaus Fuchs was born into a Protestant family with liberal leanings, and in school he was already politically active. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party, the German Labour Party, and also of the paramilitary wing of the German Republican movement, the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold. After school, Fuchs went on to study physics, first at the Christian Albrechts University in Kiel, and after that at the Friedrich Wilhelms University in Berlin, and apparently he was quite good at it. Somewhere around that time he was thrown out of the Social Democratic Party, apparently for being too much of a leftist, and right away joined the German Communist Party. When Hitler took power in 1933, being a communist turned out not to be all that good for your career. Klaus Fuchs, however, despite being on the wanted list, managed to carry on his studies for an additional 5 months, which is indicative of a few things. First of all, the Nazi system of terror wasn't as effective in 1933 as it would become later in the war. Then we have the fact that prior to the Gleichschaltung, students and staff at German universities weren't exactly sympathetic towards Hitler. And in addition to that, Klaus Fuchs was also apparently quite good at hiding. However, in August of 1933, Fuchs had to flee, first to Paris and then to Great Britain. There he attended the University of Bristol and the University of Edinburgh, was awarded a doctorate in physics and worked quite successfully as a theoretical physicist. Well, up to this point there's nothing special about him. His story is not in any way different from the stories of other intellectuals who had to flee the Nazis and found a new home in England. When the war broke out, he was put into an internment camp as an enemy alien for some time, but the British soon discovered how valuable he really was, and soon he was drafted into the Tube Alloys program, the British effort to develop an atomic bomb, which would ultimately lead to the detonation of the Empire's first atomic device in Australia in 1952. For his contribution to the war effort he was also awarded British citizenship. Well, up to this point everything looked awesome for the British, right? I mean, they took the help of a German physicist, thus enlisting some very valuable resources in order to develop nuclear weapons. Everything was fine. Now was it? No. It turns out in 1941 Fuchs was contacted by and recruited into the Military Intelligence Agency of the Soviet Chief of Staff, the GRU. That way, Stalin was fully aware of any recent development in the British nuclear weapon program. Now, how was that bad? I mean, obviously Tube Alloys wasn't going anywhere during the war. After all, it took the British until 1952 to set off their first bomb, way after the Soviet Union did. Well, the reason for that was that the joint Anglo-American effort was mostly concentrated on another project. The Manhattan Project was where all the resources went. And by resources I mean personnel, and by personnel I mean Klaus Fuchs. In 1943 he shipped over to the US to work on yet another nuclear weapon program. He was first assigned to Columbia University in New York and later to Los Alamos. There he made some very important contributions to the understanding of implosion processes in the core of nuclear bombs. As you probably know, the Manhattan Project culminated in the world's first nuclear test, Trinity, in 1945, and then in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet at the same time he was feeding intelligence to Stalin that would greatly aid the Soviet nuclear program and ultimately lead to the Russians' first nuclear test, RDS-1 or Joe 1 in 1949. Clearly at that point the Americans already knew that Stalin wouldn't be their best friend forever. Still, they didn't bother to perform a background check on a possible Soviet spy. They figured the British already did. Why yes, the British did perform a background check and figured that Fuchs was a communist and thus very unlikely to be a Nazi spy. So much for that. Now, there were a number of spies in the Manhattan Project. What sets Fuchs apart is that he wasn't providing general military intelligence on the state of the program for strategic planning. He was in fact providing technical data and details on implosion and uranium separation. Stuff that the undoubtedly brilliant Soviet scientists could have figured out themselves, given more time. What he did was simply making the job a whole lot quicker and easier for them. When the war was over, Fuchs moved back to the UK. In 1949 he was suspected to be a spy for the first time and interrogated by the MI5. During the first interrogation session he denied all accusations, but later in 1950 he spontaneously and voluntarily confessed. Fuchs was put on trial, where he was prosecuted by no one other than Hartley Shawcross, the former lead British prosecutor at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. The trial lasted only 90 minutes and Fuchs was found guilty of espionage, but since the Soviet Union was a friendly nation when the crime was committed, he couldn't be found guilty of treason. So he was sentenced to 14 years in prison and stripped of his British citizenship. During his time in prison, Fuchs claimed that his intention had only been to help the Soviet Union against the Nazis, and that thanks to him all-out war between the Soviet Union and the West had been avoided, since both sides now possessed nuclear weapons. A statement that would become pretty hard to deny later in the Cold War, when the balance of military power would become paramount to keep the peace, since both sides assumed a strategy of mutually assured destruction. Anyway, Fuchs was released in 1959, after serving 9 of his 14 years, and moved to communist Eastern Germany, where he became a professor of physics at Dresden University and a distinguished hero of the people. So, that's it? Well, yes. Actually, that's where obvious historical facts that we have hard evidence for end. But there are some accounts of a continuation of this story that may or may not be true in all details, which are nonetheless interesting to tell. For that we need to talk about China. The People's Republic of China, to be precise, as we are talking about the large country on the Asian mainland, ruled by the Communist Party of China, and not about the little remnants of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan. Now, these little remnants actually are important, as Mao wanted them bad, and in fact the Chinese still want them today. So, both the Korean War and the Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1954 and 55, which was about, you guessed it, Taiwan, or rather some small islands under the influence of Taiwan, made Mao want his own bomb. Of course, he turned to the Soviet ally under Nikita Khrushchev, who was more than happy to provide help. Not only did the Soviets aid the Chinese in building enrichment facilities in order to purify uranium for their nuclear weapons program, they also sent a bunch of scientists and engineers to offer a helping hand. They also gave technical advice and data, and at one point promised to give Mao a prototype bomb. That was until the Sino-Soviet split of 1960, which ended up totally alienating the two major communist powers. Now, the Sino-Soviet split was about a few things. First of all, Mao and Khrushchev simply didn't go along very well. Ever since Stalin died, Mao wanted to be the boss of the communist world, pointing out his seniority over Khrushchev as the longest-serving leader. Khrushchev, of course, begged to differ, since the true military and economic power lay within the Soviet Union. In addition to that, there also were some ideological differences, mainly the issue of Maoism versus Marxism-Leninism, which are two distinct systems, the details of which I'm not going to go into here because, frankly, I don't know much about communism. And then there was also the question if there could be a peaceful coexistence with the West, which both of them couldn't agree on. And finally, Khrushchev at some point came to the conclusion that Mao was really fucking crazy. You see, Mao was willing to risk a fully blown war over Taiwan And when Khrushchev pointed out to him that the Americans, who had a defense agreement with the Republic of China, would probably use nuclear weapons to defend it, Mao allegedly said that he could spare a few million Chinese. After all, there was almost 1 billion of them. So Khrushchev went all "no bomb for you" on Mao, and all the Soviet technicians were withdrawn from the Chinese nuclear weapons program. Well, not officially. They just went like on holiday for a few days or got back home to undergo medical treatment, and then they never returned. At the same time, Soviet scientists were feeding the Chinese faulty data. I mean, the Chinese were all like, "Oh, we appreciate all the help you're giving us, but somehow our reactor doesn't work." Yeah. So, the Chinese were faced with the problem of how to get the information they needed. Well, how about turning to someone who knows everything there is to know about nuclear weapons? How about an East German professor of physics? How about Klaus Fuchs? During that time it was quite commonplace for communist governments to send their aspiring young scientists to study abroad at good universities of friendly nations. So without arousing any suspicion, and with the declared consent of the East German government, keeping to the communist ideal of friendship among nations, Chinese physicists studied in East Germany, learning peculiar details about nuclear weapons design from, you guessed it, Klaus Fuchs. And so, at Lopno test site in China in 1964, the first Chinese nuclear test went by the name of 596, and not much is known about it. In fact, it seems there are no photos available of it to the public, so please excuse the visual representation. What can we take from all this? Well, for one, Klaus Fuchs really did turn out to be one of the most important people of 20th century history. After all, he contributed to nuclear armament of the world's 4 largest military powers. Second of all, sometimes my enemy's enemy turns out to be my enemy once the enemy is dealt with, and sometimes even my friend turns out to be my enemy. And third of all, a secret that too many people know about soon isn't going to be a secret anymore. Thanks for your kind attention.